Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part one of Designing and Operating Roads for the Aging Population. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. Looking at the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a PDF copy of the course presentation is available for reference. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to our instructor, Mark Doctor with FHWA. Hello.
Hey, Mike, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Be glad to be here. Welcome to our workshop, Designing Roadways for the Aging Population. As Mike mentioned, it's a two-part series. So we're going to go for 90 minutes today, and then on Thursday at the same time, finish up with the second part of the training. So I'm Mark Doctor with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. I am physically out of Atlanta, Georgia, but that's one great thing about remote workshops. We can really be anywhere, but the only sad thing is I've got a lot of thunderstorms rolling through Atlanta right now, but hopefully that won't be an issue. I'm on the safety and design team within FHWA, and I'm involved in a lot of safety activities, intersections, the safe system approach, and for a number of years been a part of the FHWA team involved in the development of our Federal Highway Administration Handbook on designing and operating roads for the aging population, which is really the basis for today's workshop. As I mentioned, we're going to be in two parts. Today we're going to talk about why we have this workshop in the handbook on roadways for the aging population. We'll talk about some of the age-related diminishing capabilities, driving and other user capabilities. Where older users are also pedestrians and bicyclists. And as part of the natural aging process, some of those skills and visual and mental and physical capabilities that we enjoy in good health can sometimes diminish, and having a better understanding of those can help us as engineering practitioners design and operate for the roads for that aging population. We'll also start talking about some of the recommendations that are in the FHWA handbook, beginning with intersections. And then on Thursday, we will finish up with intersections. I don't think we're going to get through all of that today. On Thursday, we'll go through an example of how to use the handbook in terms of considering the recommendations, assessing when they're appropriate to implement, and then we'll also talk about other recommendations, non-intersection related in the handbook, related to freeway interchanges and roadway segments. So the key reference that this workshop draws its material from is the FHWA handbook for designing roadways for the aging population. This handbook is available from the FHWA webpage. You can download the entire document. There's also a desk reference, which is an abridged version of the handbook, and the desk reference focuses primarily on the recommendations. But both publications can be downloaded for free from our FHWA webpage, and also in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar box, you can download these slides, so you don't have to write all of the URL addresses to get these materials. But this handbook is intended to provide practitioners with information about things that we can do, strategies that we can do to design and operate our roads safer for the aging population. But the reality is, everything that we would do for the aging population actually has a safety benefit for all users. The key difference is there are some safety provisions or some safety measures that we implement that have an even higher benefit for the aging population. But there's really nothing that is in this handbook that is not a safety measure that would benefit all users. It's just that research has demonstrated an additional benefit for older users. Now, why? Why the attention focused on older users? Well, we are an aging population. You may have heard the term the gray tsunami. Well, demographically, the numbers and the percentages of older people in America will continue to increase. The numbers of Americans age 65 and older is projected to double by 2060. So if you think about the older user, or what would be a representative user of our system, maybe a design user, what capabilities of a typical human being are appropriate to assume certain roadway or pedestrian design criteria. Well, as we age, that older user would be more appropriate to be our representative person that we design for. And this is a particular issue in Ohio. If we look at the Ohio State Strategic Highway Safety Plan, older users is identified as one of the emphasis areas. And people age 65 and older represent the fastest growing segment of drivers in Ohio as well as nationally. And if we look at the safety trends compared to a decade ago, sadly, we have seen an increase in Ohio in terms of the fatalities and serious injuries that are represented by older drivers. Now, the definition of older drivers, we typically use people age 65 and above. But as I get into more detail, you'll see that age is just a number, and we all age at different rates in terms of how our abilities as drivers or pedestrians or bicyclists, we age at different rates, and it's a very individual thing. But as we get beyond 65 into our 70s and 80s, that is when, for most people, the diminishing capabilities start to catch up with most of us. So in Ohio, one of the top strategies identified in the Strategic Highway Safety Plan is to promote the use and installation of roadway improvements that compensate for impacts of aging on safe driving. And that's really what this workshop is all about. We're delighted to be able to present this workshop through Ohio LTAP to help support this strategy in Ohio's Strategic Highway Safety Plan. So there is good news if we think about older drivers collectively. Older drivers tend to be safe drivers in terms of not demonstrating risky behavior. So in other words, older drivers tend to not speed as much. Older drivers tend to not be under the influence of alcohol, and older drivers tend not to be aggressive drivers. So across the spectrum of age groups, we actually see where drivers 65 and older are best represented in terms of not being involved in crashes. So in terms of driver involvement rates per 1,000 licensed drivers, the 65 and over age group has the lowest involvement in crashes. Good news. However, the not so good news is that when older drivers are involved in a crash, the outcome tends to be more severe. Now, part of this is the fact that as we age and our bodies get more frail, the ability to withstand the crash impacts become less so. The damage, the physical damage to the human body will increase as we get older. In other words, you take the same collision, the same car, impacting at the same speed. Let's say that everyone's wearing a seatbelt and the same airbags. Well, that collision, and if we put a 18-year-old healthy individual in the driver's seat, compared to if it's someone in their 80s and maybe they have underlying health conditions, well, the outcome of that exact same crash may be very different for those two individuals. So sadly, we do see fatal crashes overrepresented as we get older, especially for the 80 and above. So the good news, older drivers tend to be safer drivers. The bad news is that when older drivers are involved in a collision, the outcome will generally be more severe. And if we look at the age groups above 65, there's not much difference between 65 to 70, 70 to 74, and then the yellow line, ages 75 to 79. Okay, now you start to see a slightly higher fatality rate, but here's where it becomes very eye-opening. At ages 80 and above, we see that sharp increase in the fatality rate, and mostly that would be expected just because at ages 80 and above, we would tend to have more underlying health conditions. It's more difficult to recover from a serious crash the older that we get. And by 2050, well, that older population of say 80 and above will be nearly 3 times more than what it currently is. So not only are we aging, but very gladly, as people see more and more birthdays, it's not uncommon to see that 85th birthday and higher. And many people enjoy the good health and continue to drive, but we do start to see that increase in fatalities at that older level. So you may have heard of something called the safe system approach. And if you haven't heard about the safe system approach, hopefully you will. It's gaining a lot of attention. It was recently acknowledged as part of the United States National Roadway Safety Strategy that USDOT put out a few months back. And one of the key principles of the safe system approach is firstly acknowledging that death and serious injury is unacceptable. But secondly, the principle that humans make mistakes, all humans. We will inevitably make mistakes on the roadway, and those mistakes can lead to crashes. Well, we know as we age, more older drivers or older pedestrians are on our road system, as we have diminishing capabilities, that can be a contributing factor to making mistakes, and those mistakes can lead to crashes. But the third principle of a safe system approach is that humans are vulnerable. We have a certain tolerance level to absorb the energy of a collision before harm occurs. And that's really the focus of a safe system approach, is to manage the outcome of a collision. When we talk about vision zero, that vision is to have 0 deaths and fatalities. It's not about eliminating crashes. It's a subtle but important distinction to recognize. Vision zero is about eliminating death and serious injury. We know that human beings make mistakes. Those mistakes can and will lead to crashes on the roadway. So we know we're never going to eliminate crashes, but what we can do is manage the consequences of those crashes. And that's where humans are vulnerable is a key aspect of implementing a safe system approach. And I think it's particularly relevant to talking about designing for the aging population, because managing the kinetic energy, the forces of a collision, and keeping them survivable and survivable to our aging population is really a big part of how many of these countermeasures and recommendations tie into the safe system approach, but also tie in to particularly being advantageous for older users. The other principles are that we all share in the responsibility to create a safe system. We want to be proactive and proactively implement safety measures on the network, and redundancy among these 5 elements. So safe road users, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, and post-crash care all work collectively, all work together toward creating the safe system. So older drivers, and some of us may actually be older drivers, but many of us are probably under 65. But you've probably seen older drivers out on the road. Maybe you've been behind one of these older drivers. So I want to start off with just asking you a question based on what you've observed on the roadway. Is there anything that annoys you about older drivers? So, Mike, if we could open up the poll.
Yes. Yes, thanks, Mark. And the poll question is open, and we'll give everybody some time to respond. And I see the responses arriving already, so that's good.
Great. Actually, Mike, I don't see the poll. Let's see.
Yeah, that might be just
Yeah, one of the
the webinar
glitches of.
platform. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mike, if you don't mind, can you read out some of the responses that are coming into the poll pod?
Absolutely. Yeah, we will close the poll in just a moment, and then we'll share the results with everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So, Mark, 43% said A, 25% said B, 24% said C, and 8% said other. And somebody wrote in the questions box, they said, we need an all of the above answer.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to have a little fun with that, and thank you, Mike, for pulling up that
Yep,
poll pod. So yeah, out on the road, we've probably observed that older drivers, maybe they drive slow, especially when making a turn, right? Or the directional blinker is always on, and they're hesitant, maybe hesitant to pull out from a stop controlled intersection or from a driveway. So yeah, I think we all would agree that we observe things about older drivers, and they may be irritating for us as other drivers on the road. But what I want to do is maybe explain why older drivers may behave this way. There's probably a good reason for it. So we're going to talk about visual, physical, and cognitive capabilities related to the driving task that can diminish with age. And many roadway design and traffic control elements can be modified or improved to better meet the aging population's perceptual, physical, and cognitive needs. So starting with visual capabilities, reduced visual acuity, reduced contrast sensitivity, reduced area of visual attention, reduced perception in motion, and increased sensitivity to glare at night, and decreased dark adaptation. These are 6 very common visual capabilities that typically diminish with age. Visual acuity, that's the sharpness of vision. Think about a typical eye test or an eye chart where we ask someone to discern the letters or numbers of a given size at a given distance. And where visual acuity or reduced visual acuity comes in for us as transportation practitioners, well, the way we communicate to drivers is through signing, right? Whether it's a warning sign, guidance sign, regulatory sign, that's primarily how we communicate, although arguably as we get more in-vehicle navigation systems, that helps with the guidance task. But no doubt for things like traffic control, we communicate that through signing. And so reduced acuity makes it more difficult for people to perceive the details on those signs. So things like larger letters, larger signs, obviously a way to help compensate for that. Reduced contrast sensitivity, that's the ability to distinguish between objects of, say, similar color or shading, and distinguish the object from its background. So if you think about pavement markings, and if we have worn pavement markings, it can be problematic for someone with reduced contrast sensitivity to make out. Or if you think about the edge of a roadway, so a curb, and just identifying where the road ends, where the curb begins, not wanting people to hit the curb, obviously, and issues with shadowing. If we have trees that may create shadowing effects, it can help make it more difficult to identify the edge of, say, a curb. And reduced contrast sensitivity can also make things seem fuzzy or ill-defined. And in addition to curbing and faded pavement markings, sometimes seeing things like perhaps a mid-block, a pedestrian crosswalk could be an example, or other features, or just a hazard perhaps, or an object in the roadway. And these problems become even more of a challenge in conditions of low light or fog, or at night with reflective glare. So contrast sensitivity, it is one of those critical functions, and at night and foggy conditions, in winter perhaps, that challenge can become even greater. You see in this series of photos for a young child stepping out into the street. So someone with restricted contrast sensitivity may not be able to see the person or the hazard in contrast to the background. Contrast sensitivity is something that could be tested for, but it's not typically included in a routine eye exam. So to get licensed, acuity is typically what is assessed, and not necessarily contrast sensitivity. The third area is the reduced area of visual attention, also known as the useful field of view or the functional field of view. As human beings, we have peripheral vision. You may be able to see even at a near 180-degree cone out there. If you think about if you took your hands, if you hold your arms out and wiggle your fingers, and start to bring your hands in, just keep wiggling your fingers. And so, yeah, you're getting some exercise at home. But this is a good test of what your useful field of view is. At what point do you start to see that your fingers are actually moving? Well, whatever that angle is, that can diminish over time. So if you think about perceiving a pedestrian on the side of the road, well, perceiving that there is motion, perceiving that person is actually moving, well, that field starts to narrow down. Also, the cone of vision that we need to actually see detail, like reading a sign, that's an even narrower cone, and that also diminishes over time. So as drivers, the cones of vision, the full horizontal view, that 180 degrees, peripheral vision, well, that's not very useful to us in the driving task. Actually, it's the useful field of view, and that is where we could pick up motion, such as a pedestrian. And then the acute field of view, that's where we would have to focus our eyes to read a sign. And that is a very narrow field of view. And when we are focusing our attention to read a sign, we tend to lose what we are capable of perceiving, even within the useful field of view. If we're concentrating on reading a sign, the other things around us, like maybe a pedestrian or a bicyclist, and especially as we age, these cones of vision start to diminish. Motion perception, that's our ability to judge, and this is typical if we think of the condition of being at a stop-controlled intersection and we're waiting for a gap in oncoming traffic. Maybe we're making a left turn out from this minor street or coming out from a driveway. And so we have to make a judgment about the speed and distance that that approaching vehicle is coming at us from, to make a judgment about whether there's an appropriate gap to make the left turn or the crossing maneuver. And that judgment and gap really is based upon our ability to interpret, our brain to interpret that moving vehicle. And we do that by the perceived difference in the size. The image gets bigger, the vehicle appears to get bigger the closer it gets. However, that appearance, and this is applicable to all ages, not just older drivers. It's a challenge for even younger drivers because we really don't perceive much of a difference in the size of the vehicle until it gets very close to us. In other words, from 1,000 feet to 500 feet, that vehicle image size doesn't get much larger. And then less than 500 feet is when we start to notice the image appears bigger, and that allows us to judge its relative proximity to us. But as we age, that ability to distinguish those slight differences in image size becomes even more challenging. Increased sensitivity to glare at night, especially in the rain, headlights of oncoming traffic, that glare effect, and our eyes need more time to recover from that interference with our focal vision. And then the sixth visual ability that diminishes is moving from light to darkness. Our eyes, the retina needs time to adapt to the change in lighting condition. Well, that ability to adapt also diminishes with age. So those are six examples of things that diminish with age. And when we do this workshop live and in person, one of the activities that I like to walk through is this one here. We're just gonna do this a little activity by individually. I'm not gonna pull up a poll pod, but I'd just like you to think for a moment. So we've got a list of various safety enhancements that are very typical that we see, putting in roadway lighting, implementing a protected only traffic signal phase, using larger signs, larger letters, high quality reflective pavement markings, overhead mounted lane assignment signs, no right turn on red, and signal backplates with retroreflective borders. So these are things that we commonly do. But now I want you to think about how those safety enhancements might help compensate for one or more of the six visual capabilities that are diminished. And if we went through this as an exercise, you'd actually see that sometimes multiple capabilities will help be mitigated with these various safety enhancements. So a lot of these common things that we do help compensate for the diminished visual abilities that are normal with the aging process. So there are some physical mobility capabilities that also diminish. We tend to lose strength and range of motion in our shoulders and legs. That can be things like our ability to turn a steering wheel and apply the brake in a rapid manner, or also reduced head and neck or upper torso flexibility. So at an intersection, perhaps our ability to turn our neck to judge for a gap in oncoming traffic, or to make a right turn on red. We We commonly have to turn our neck or upper body, torso in the driving act, and that can become more challenging as we age. So the ability to make turns, use the steering wheel, or shift the foot from the accelerator to the brake, or apply the appropriate pressure to the brake, these are all things that can be influenced by reduced strength. And for head and neck upper mobility, looking over the shoulder to check for blind spots, looking for gaps in traffic, and pulling out of an intersection, the look left, right, left, or as a pedestrian when crossing the street, same thing, to judge for gaps to cross the street. One of the things I really miss about not doing this workshop in person is an activity that we would do at this point to help participants better understand those diminishing abilities. And so we would sometimes pass out neck braces to represent that loss in upper torso mobility. And we hand out glasses to mimic things like reduced visual acuity or contrast sensitivity. There are filters that can replicate conditions like if you have various sight issues, something as simple as blurring or clouding of the eyes. So just wanted you to take a moment to maybe better appreciate why older drivers sometimes behave the way they do. Sometimes it's explained by these reduced physical and visual abilities. And there's cognitive abilities as well: diminished selective attention, increased perception and reaction time, and diminished working memory skills. So selective attention, especially at intersections in the driving task, we have to pay attention to a lot of different things. If I'm wanting to figure out what lane I need to be in to get to my destination, whether I'm turning or going straight, well, I may be focused so much on the sign or the traffic signal head, and I may not be aware of, say, a vehicle pulling out of a driveway near the intersection. So the ability to process information from multiple sources simultaneously is something that does diminish as we age. Perception reaction time, that's the time to make a decision about what is necessary in the driving task and then initiate a movement. So typically it's identifying something ahead that requires me as a driver to apply the brake. And so that perception reaction time we may need a longer perception reaction time as we age. And then lastly, a diminished working memory. Working memory is that ability to recall information that we haven't committed to memory, but it's kind of the near-term memory. So for example, if I gave you a telephone number and you had to remember all the digits of a telephone number, that can be hard to do. And as we age, that becomes even more difficult, and something else may wipe out that information. So if you think you're like a phone number, if you try to repeat it in your head, but then someone asks you a question, like, oh, you may have just totally had that phone number wiped away. Well, in the driving task, this is what can happen with something like a dynamic message sign. If we're trying to convey information that maybe use exit so-and-so to get to a particular location, or road closed ahead, use detour, or exit 59. Well, all right, by the time I actually get to exit 59, I may have forgotten that. So that's why providing information multiple times can be very, very helpful. So all of those things that we talked about that may annoy us about older drivers, well, maybe now we can better appreciate perhaps why older drivers respond the way they do. So let me take a pause at this point, and Mike, let me ask, are there any questions that may have come in so far?
Yes, thanks, Mark. We have two questions from Jenny. The first question is comparable research about age of people in crashes available in Florida?
Excellent question. So I don't know specifically, but I'm gonna say probably because I do know that for Florida, they have a very active uh, older user campaign and community. And at one point, they even had a dedicated web page dedicated to older user safety in Florida. And I don't have that web link off the top of my head, but I can follow up with you, Jenny. And but I'm gonna say most probably that similar information is available in Florida. There are many states that are very active in trying to advance older user safety and have good data that can be used as well.
Thanks, Mark. And Jenny also mentioned that she had been trying to get data about persons with disabilities involved in crashes. And her follow-up question was, wouldn't this awareness about the need to improve safety have more impact if the stats about persons with disabilities and the aging population were added together?
Interesting. So, yeah, good, very good question. And yeah, in this workshop, arguably we are focusing on uh, older users that would have more perhaps common abilities that decline with age, but certainly for the physical disabled community, there's of course the need to provide accessible facilities. That is still an overarching need for our transportation system. And so as pedestrians, there are certain things that we do as a matter of practice, just to make sure that our facilities are accessible, compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's not to say that, similarly that certain safety measures could have an added benefit as well. But yeah, predominantly today we're going to focus, or today and Thursday we're focusing on those things in the handbook, which are not, I guess, directly uh, considering that the physical disability community. But no doubt there's a lot of overlap and a lot of correlation. And in terms of the statistics, yes, I think anytime we have a better sense of what the needs of the community that we're designing for and providing a facility for can certainly help us make better decisions on how we design and operate the roads. So thank you, Jenny. Yeah, great comment and actually a suggestion in there too. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We also have a question from Scott. He says, does research exist that explains how a driver may focus on a large near object, such as a bridge pier, and not see approaching objects that may be upstream of the near object? Is this explained by a decrease of contrast sensitivity?
Ooh, wow, excellent question. I'm gonna have to plead ignorance on that one. I don't know for sure. There may be research on that, but I am not specifically aware of that. But it's your premise is very logical and a possibility, but I'm not aware of research along those lines. But that's not to say it doesn't exist. But interesting possibility. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. And also in the questions box, Stephanie has shared that ODOT has a new older driver safety page, and we'll send out that link to everybody to check that out.
Great, fantastic, good. I'm glad ODOT's got that. That's a great resource, great reference.
And
All
that's
right.
all the questions for now. Thanks, Mark.
All right, Mike, thank you. And thank you, everybody. And yeah, I just want to encourage folks to continue to enter questions into the chat box. We'll pause periodically and try to answer some of the questions, and also at the end today and on Thursday. So great, thanks. So let's dive into the FHWA handbook, and intersections represent a big chunk of what is in the handbook, because intersections are particularly problematic or challenging for older users. So let's first try to understand why intersections are such a challenge, and then look at the potential treatments that can be used. Well, intersections are challenging for all users. They require a lot of decisions. They require us to make actions or maneuvers, and sometimes even evasive maneuvers. We have to follow traffic control devices. We have to navigate perhaps through a choice of multiple lanes, depending upon whether we're going right, left, or through, or sometimes we even have multi-legged intersections. So oftentimes we have to make rapid decisions. We have to have quick reactions. We have to make accurate judgments of speed and distance. And all of these are those things, those abilities that can commonly diminish with age. So if we look at the data, about 37% of traffic fatalities for people age 65 and older occur at intersections, and compare that to about 18% of the general population, or the under 64 and under group. So yes, traffic fatalities at intersections are statistically overrepresented within the 65 and above group. And that sadly is the case for pedestrian fatalities at intersections as well. Pedestrians 65 and older are overrepresented at intersections. So we're going to talk about treatments that are identified in the handbook, and I'm going to subcategorize them. It's a little different from how they're categorized in the FHWA handbook, but I think this is an easier way to think about them. So we're going to talk about design types of treatments, things that might be done as a project is developing, or a safety project perhaps, but these are things that would involve physical construction with the intersection. And then there are treatments that involve signing, marking, and lighting. So these might be things that we don't necessarily need a project for. These might be things that could be done with lower cost, or possibly even implemented by maintenance forces. If the intersection is signalized, there are some things that can be done specific to the traffic signal operations. And then the fourth category involves pedestrian crossings at intersections. So the design treatments that are covered in the handbook are roundabouts, reduced left turn conflict intersections, minimizing the skew angle, if there is a skew angle, utilizing an appropriate curb radius at the intersection, and the use of raised channelization at the intersection, as well as having ample intersection sight distance for those permissive type of maneuvers. So let's start off with roundabouts. And the handbook does recommend that roundabouts be considered in the implementation or redesign of existing intersections. Roundabouts are very effective at eliminating those severe right angle crashes. So compared to a traffic signal or a stop controlled intersection where someone runs a red light or someone blows through a stop sign, that would result in a 90-degree collision at a high speed. Under the safe system approach, we better understand that from a kinetic energy management perspective, not only is speed part of the kinetic energy that is transferred to the body in a crash, but the angle of the impact. So for two cars that are colliding at an intersection, we actually have less protection that our vehicles give us if we're impacted on the sides. So if you think about getting hit on your driver's side door or the passenger side door, there's less less steel, less metal, say compared to what would be absorbed by the vehicle body in a rear end collision or even a head-on collision, even though a head-on collision typically involves the two vehicles at high speed. It's actually the part of the car that gives us the most absorption of kinetic energy through the front crumple zone area. So yeah, it's a higher impact energy, but it's also where the vehicle gives us most protection. Where we get the least protection, those 90-degree side T-bone crashes. Roundabouts virtually eliminate that. If you think about a roundabout, it's essentially a right in, right out kind of intersection. If you want to make a left turn movement, well, you start by, it's not directly a right turn, but it's kind of like a right turn when you're on the approach to a roundabout and coming into the circulatory roadway. Even if a vehicle doesn't yield to traffic in the circulatory roadway, sometimes the physical geometry of the roundabout, the splitter island, produces that deflection where if someone did not yield and they collide with another vehicle in the circulating roadway, the angle of impact between the entering vehicle and the circulating vehicle is probably not going to be 90 degrees. In fact, it may be more like a 40-degree angle of impact. That reduction in the angle of collision, instead of a 90-degree T-bone type of crash, if it's a 40-degree collision, it has about the same effect as if the speeds of the cars that are colliding were about 20 miles an hour less. So even if someone doesn't slow down, and we hope they do, roundabouts are typically very good at slowing approaching traffic, but even if someone doesn't slow, if someone doesn't yield, if nothing else, hopefully the angle of collision gets to be less severe. It makes the crash more survivable. We know roundabouts are safer. Part of it has to do with the geometry, the physics that are involved. We said that intersections are problematic for older users. Part of that, especially at a signalized intersection, is the judging of gaps in oncoming traffic. So if you think about a permissive left turn, so sometimes we have protected only left turn signal phasing where you can only make the left turn on a green arrow. But a lot of intersections operate either with protected permissive or sometimes permissive only, where to make the left turn, we are waiting for a gap in oncoming traffic. Well, judging that gap in oncoming traffic is something that diminishes as we age. Roundabouts eliminate the need to make that judgment. It's easier to judge for a gap that is on your left side as you're entering the roundabout. Roundabouts, the circulating traffic is typically at a lower speed. So it makes it easier to make those judgments. So things being slower, less judgments to be made, and when crashes do occur, they are typically not as severe. Not only are all of these things consistent with the safe system approach, but they are also very consistent with how we can design and operate intersections with the older user in mind. All of these advantages are particularly advantageous to older users. For a pedestrian, well, the pedestrian only has to cross one direction of traffic at a time. The splitter island can provide a refuge and shorten the exposure distance for the pedestrian crossing. And as we mentioned, the geometry of roundabouts typically reduce vehicle speeds, increasing the likelihood of yielding to pedestrians, but also lower speeds increases the survivability of a crash if a collision occurs. Roundabouts are particularly advantageous when we've got skewed intersections or intersections with more than 4 approaches. Roundabouts are always great choices when you're trying to deal with these complex geometry type intersections. Now, the handbook does have a recommendation that roundabouts be limited to single lane roundabouts, one lane entrances and one lane of circulating traffic. Well, why? What's the issue with multi-lane roundabouts? Well, multi-lane roundabouts are more challenging. They are more challenging for motorists, certainly starting with the key decision of what lane should I be in. If it's just a 2-lane roundabout, it's really a choice, right lane or the left lane. But even with good signs, good markings, there are still some challenges that we see at multi-lane roundabouts that we don't see at single lane roundabouts. We've basically opened up an opportunity with multi-lane roundabouts for more errors to occur. Things like on entry to a multi-lane roundabout, the entering driver needs to yield to both lanes. And sometimes, especially when the entry approach and the exit leg of the roundabout have a larger separation distance between the entry and the exit, it can be confusing that the driver in that inside lane, say the left lane in the circulating roadway, may be exiting. And for most 2-lane roundabouts, it is very common where the 2 through lanes are permitted to make the through maneuver. A left turn made from the left lane, right turn made from the right lane, but very commonly the 2 through lane, or the 2 lanes allow for the through movement. So that white car in the figure there on the left maybe making that through movement, maybe they entered from the top approach, and the yellow vehicle not yielding to both lanes. So we see those types of problems not yielding to both lanes. We also see on entry, and the geometry of the roundabout may or may not contribute to this, but the appropriate entering path. And so a vehicle in the right lane on the entry should enter the circulatory roadway in the proper receiving lane, but sometimes drivers cut into the improper lane of a multi-lane roundabout, so failing to maintain lane position, or people that are making a improper maneuver in the circulating roadway. So say, for example, a driver that is essentially making a left turn, but doing so from the right lane of the multi-lane roundabout. So an improper left turn. These are 3 types of conflicts that can lead to collisions at multi-lane roundabouts that we don't see at single lane roundabouts. So yes, there's more opportunity for conflict. That's the bad news. The good news, however, is that even with these additional complications that we have with multi-lane roundabouts, because of the lower speeds, when these collisions occur at multi-lane roundabouts, they tend to be less severe. They tend to be the minor property damage only crashes. So oftentimes we implement a multi-lane roundabout because of the higher traffic volumes, right? The higher demand to satisfy the higher volumes. But there can be a trade-off in terms of more crashes. But under a safe system approach, we know that our focus is on eliminating death and serious injuries. And so one of the positives of multi-lane roundabouts is even if we have more crashes, we may or will likely have a significant drop in the fatal and severe crashes, especially compared to a signalized intersection. So that recommendation is in the handbook, but I don't want to be too negative or too discouraging, I guess, about multi-lane roundabouts. Yes, multi-lane roundabouts have these potential challenges. These crashes can occur, but the good news is they tend to be less severe. And there are things that are emerging with multi-lane roundabouts, the spiral design, turbo roundabouts that introduce a raised feature separating the lane lines in a multi-lane roundabout. These are emerging things on multi-lane roundabouts that may actually help improve safety performance down the road for multi-laners. And there's the possibility of what's known as a 2x1. You see that picture on the left there, where the major roadway might have 2 lanes. And so there's a 2-lane entries on half of the roundabout, and there's 2 circulating lanes through half of the roundabout. And if the minor road can be kept to a single lane entry, it may allow for this 2x1 hybrid. And the safety performance of the 2x1 hybrids are typically well, better than a full 2x2 and comparable more so to a single lane roundabout. So with roundabouts, I guess the rule of thumb is less is better in terms of number of lanes. Fewer number of lanes, generally the better safety performance. So when designing roundabouts, think in terms of if we don't need the extra capacity right away, maybe we're designing for a future condition, maybe making the roundabout expandable in the future, but opening it up and operating it based upon your current needs. So roundabouts, reduced left turn conflict intersections, the other geometry. These are things like the restricted crossing U-turn intersections, the median U-turns. They basically redirect left turn movements at the main intersection. We talked about the problems of left turn maneuvers. Well, these are also ways to help mitigate those left turn problems. If we think about a traditional open median type intersection, especially in a rural area on a divided highway where the major road does not stop, the minor road has stop control. Well, it's inevitably those far side angle collisions that we see as the problem on these types of rural intersections. As motorists, we do a better job of judging for gaps on the near side, less so on the far side. And so that's where the restricted crossing U-turn, or also known as a J-turn, comes into play, where traffic coming out of the minor street makes a right turn, goes to the downstream location, makes a U-turn, and if they wanted to make the left or the crossing maneuver, they do so by continuing straight or making the right turn. It basically breaks up the decision points. It makes it easier to judge for gaps or view oncoming traffic one direction at a time, make one decision at a time. And so things like the restricted crossing U-turn can be particularly advantageous to the aging population. So R-cuts and median U-turns, the Federal Highway Administration has some great informational guides that you can get from our FHWA intersections webpage on these reduced left turn conflict intersections. For skew angle, most intersections are with a 90-degree crossing, and but not all intersections have that. Sometimes we have a skew, and that skew can be problematic. Typically, if that angle becomes less than 75 degrees, 90 degrees being the ideal, but then if we get to less than 75, that's when the skew can be problematic. The skew angle can necessitate greater neck turning in order to make a judgment to see traffic coming from the left direction. It may increase the length of a crosswalk, making it more difficult for a pedestrian to cross. It may reduce the ability of a pedestrian to see drivers, especially drivers that may be looking the other way for a gap in traffic. So this would be, say, a stop-controlled minor intersection. So that skew angle does have a direct influence on what could be called the head turn angle. What would be required of a driver to look to their left, look over their shoulder to see approaching traffic. And when the intersection skew angle is less than 75 degrees, that's when that head turn angle would start to approach 140 degrees, and that can be particularly challenging. So some things that can be done if we can't eliminate the skew, and obviously a lot of existing intersections that has skew, you're probably not going to have an opportunity to change the geometry. So things like eliminating the turn on red at a signalized intersection. So make it a no right turn on red. Another challenge of a skewed intersection is for drivers making a turn. In this illustration, you can imagine how difficult it might be to make that left turn. That is a hard steering maneuver to make at the intersection. So one of the recommendations in the FHWA handbook actually talks about increasing the receiving lane width, the throat width, basically, of the receiving lane. And this would be particularly applicable when we do have a skew, a hard skew angle like this. Now, it could be where, and say it's a signalized intersection. So when the driver is making that left turn, there would not be a bicyclist in the bicycle lane, but that bicycle lane could effectively be a way of increasing that receiving throat width for that left turn. But even if there's not a bike lane, sometimes just adding to the lane width for the receiving lane at a badly skewed intersection. And curb radius, well, especially both in urban and rural areas. It's a trade-off that we make at intersections with the design of the curb radius. Obviously, to facilitate the swept path of a vehicle, especially a larger vehicle like a truck or a bus, but to do so in consideration of what the effect is of the curb radius to pedestrians and also turning speeds, because there's an advantage for keeping vehicular turning speeds, right turning speeds, lower. So getting the appropriate curb radius really is an important engineering exercise. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, but sometimes just a little difference in the curb radius can have a significant difference in terms of the pedestrian crossing distance, and that equates to the pedestrian crossing time as well, the exposure, but also the vehicle speed, the vehicle turning speed at the intersection. So there's a risk in over accommodating for the needs of a larger vehicle, especially if those larger vehicles are very infrequent. But having a curb radius that allows for shorter pedestrian crossing distances, slower turning speeds, has an advantage to pedestrians. So paying attention to the details, and perhaps even things like a compound curve or a three-centered curve to try to accommodate those needs of turning vehicles, but also without being detrimental to keeping crosswalk lengths short and turning speeds slow. So there is guidance out there on modern designs. And also for designers, it's important to recognize that there's a difference between the curb radius and the effective turning radius. So sometimes in the urban context, maybe we have on-street parking, maybe we have bike lanes, and so those features can actually help facilitate a larger effective turning radius to accommodate the needs of a bus or a truck, but yet to keep that curb radius appropriate so that we're not making crosswalks longer than they have to be or the turning speeds faster than they have to be. And related to this is right turn channelization. The handbook does talk about right turn channelization, the preference for locating a crosswalk where the crosswalk is visible to approaching traffic, but also slowing the approaching traffic and having that right turn maneuver not be a fast maneuver, but an appropriate speed for turning. And so the general trend, the modern types of designs, reduce that radius and make it a slower right turn path. But that also has the positive effect of reducing that angle, that look back angle, which we mentioned for older users, is a very important consideration. And sometimes we can even make these subtle changes without the need to reconstruct. Here's a good example of before and after condition where that change was made essentially through striping, just revising the pavement markings to replicate what that better channelization would be in terms of the reduced angle. So right turn channelization, here's a great guidance that is available for free through the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, Web Document 208, Design Guidance for Channelized Right Turn Lanes. It is a very important engineering detail. It may seem like a minor detail, but it's not. It's really one of those ways in intersection design that engineers can really practice their craft and come up with a very appropriate design that meets the needs for all users. Refuge islands, there's also choices. The cut through can be very advantageous, especially advantageous for visually impaired pedestrians that can make use of the raised features to help navigate through the refuge island. And here you see a good photo illustration with the accessible features, the truncated domes at the cut through. So right turn channelization addressed in the handbook. There's also a recommendation in the handbook that is particular to rural conditions. So this would be in a rural context. In this photo, you see a North Carolina example. So no sidewalks in this example. And so what the handbook is recommending is a right turn acceleration lane. And again, this is a rural high speed type of context. What that helps is allows the right turn driver to basically have an acceleration lane, and so to make instead of a judgment in oncoming traffic from a stop condition, they're basically accelerating. Use of the side view mirrors can kick in to help make a judgment for essentially a lane change maneuver. Median and left turn channelization. The handbook makes a preference for raised channelization as opposed to a center painted buffer or a two-way left turn lane, especially when traffic volumes on the roadway exceed 20,000 vehicles a day. This is consistent with recommendations found in access management guidance as well. The Transportation Research Board's Access Management Manual has a similar recommendation for when traffic volumes exceed that 20,000 level, that having raised medians as opposed to the center two-way left turn lane. And arguably there's more to it than just the traffic volume. The number of driveways, the number of conflict points can also be an important factor, and that raised median better helps reduce the conflicts of multiple driveways along a corridor. For this channelization, the handbook does make a recommendation for sloping curb style as opposed to a vertical curb style. A sloping curb, if you think about a driver, any driver, and if you think about your tires, and if you've ever hit a vertical curb at a higher speed, it can actually pull the tire off the rim. A sloping curb, a little more forgiving. Now, vertical curbs these are for median and channelization islands. Vertical curves are appropriate for things like a downtown condition with on-street parking, so that vehicles aren't able to pop up onto a sidewalk. But the vertical curve is a more forgiving design if it is inadvertently hit by a car's tire. And intersection sight distance. The handbook does make recommendations for what is consistent with our design guidance, things like what is in the AASHTO Green Book for geometric design. And it is based upon a gap acceptance distance, but providing ample intersection sight distance to allow for those judgments for gaps. Now, oftentimes, especially for existing intersections, we find that those design values, those desirable design values for intersection sight distance, may not match what real world conditions actually provide. There was a really good research paper that came out a couple of years back from Minnesota and looked at sight distance, especially at rural intersections. And what it really found is even if you cannot get the full intersection sight distance values, having at least 1,000 feet of sight distance at a rural location where the minor street is stop controlled, and trying to do that systemically, there's a real benefit to having at least 1,000 feet of that intersection sight distance, and the study found a good safety benefit in doing so. So just to acknowledge that, yes, there's the desirable sight distance or the design value of sight distance, and then there's what's actually available. And sometimes for existing locations, trying to do strategies to just increase the available sight distance, even if it doesn't get us up to the full desirable. There's still a safety advantage to doing that. And sometimes it's as simple as vegetation clearing to increase those sight triangles. Offset left turn lanes, another geometric feature. So if you think about a intersection that involves permissive left turns, it could be a signalized intersection where the left turn could be made on a flashing yellow arrow or a green ball, and the driver making the left turn has to make a judgment for a gap in oncoming traffic. Or it could be a minor street stop controlled intersection. So the main street doesn't have a signal. Minor road may have a stop control, but the same condition occurs for the left turn maneuver on the major street. The driver has to make a judgment for a gap in oncoming traffic. Well, we want to be able to see oncoming traffic, and that's where having a positive offset between the left turn lanes is particularly advantageous. We have more sight distance if we don't have the obstruction of a vehicle in the opposing left turn lane directly across from us. So trying to provide that positive offset. Here's an example. So imagine you're the driver wanting to make a left turn. Here's what you see. There is a vehicle in the opposing left turn lane. That driver is also waiting to have a gap in oncoming traffic and make the left turn. Well, the vehicles in the opposite left turn lane are obviously blocking our view. And maybe by the time we can see a vehicle approaching, and maybe they're approaching at high speeds, maybe this is a 45-mile-an-hour roadway, maybe even higher. Well, there's just not a lot of time. And once you make that left turn maneuver, you may be committed to making that maneuver without being able to see adequately that oncoming driver. That's where positive offset really can help. This is an illustration that shows a truck in the opposing left turn lane. And for a truck, they do an even better job of blocking our view. So the worst case is the negative offset, no offset, and positive offset. And once we have an adequate amount of positive offset, So for positive 6 feet, there's not much more additional benefit of a 12-foot offset. But the handbook does give us recommended guidance for what those positive offset values would be. And it does also make a distinction between whether it would be an opposing car in the left turn lane or an opposing truck. We may want to use the opposing truck value if we have a high percentage of trucks at the intersection, especially making the left turn maneuver. But this is really good guidance found in the handbook. It is based upon the design speed of the major road. And again, it's very applicable when we have a permissive left turn condition. There's also positive offset for the right turn maneuver. Sometimes at a rural intersection, if a vehicle is slowing down to make a right turn, that vehicle can cast a shadow of a vehicle in the left lane that is continuing straight through. So having a positive offset right turn lane helps eliminate that visibility shadow of a car that's slowing down to make a right turn at, say, a rural type of intersection. So here's an example, a real world example of positive right turn offset. This is a Kentucky example. And another advantage of the positive offset right turn, if you see the stop bar that was obliterated there, you can actually move the stop bar further up because that can also help decrease the likelihood of a visibility shadow being created. So at this point, I mentioned that we probably wouldn't get through all of the intersection recommendations, but let me take a pause and just see if we have any questions to this point. So Mike, are there any questions in the chat pod at this point about intersections?
Yes, Mark, there was a lot of questions and comments regarding roundabouts.
Okay.
So we'll combine the first two. So Francis said, a lot of seniors are intimidated by roundabouts. And then Jay said, it seems when I am driving a roundabout that the aging population has the most difficulty in knowing how to use them. Is there data to back this up, or is it just me?
It's not just you. There's a lot of, I would say, empirical feedback. And I'll also say that sometimes when an agency proposes a roundabout, well, maybe this is not a fair statement. When an agency proposes a roundabout, oftentimes they get pushback across all population groups. It seems like everybody hates roundabouts. You don't have to be old to hate roundabouts. Everybody hates roundabouts, but it does seem, at least sometimes, where there is pushback or a dislike or a distrust of roundabouts, and I would say, from the aging population, we hear those comments as well. But I don't know that anything shows that it's that they're hated more as you get older than being hated more by any other demographic in the population group. People just don't seem to like roundabouts, and we've learned that lesson. But one thing that the data is very clear about, and it's really undeniable, is the safety benefit. And so whether it's a roundabout or a reduced left turn conflict intersection like an R-cut, or anything that is perhaps different, I think we could be fair in saying that as a population, we don't like change. And certainly for the aging population, okay, maybe they don't like change either. And I'm being broad probably in my categorizations here, but note that there's really nothing specific that says for older drivers it's more of a of a problem or more hated, but there is that information about the safety benefit. And we know conclusively roundabouts are very effective at greatly reducing fatal and serious injury collisions. And that carries over even more so to the older population. So yeah, they may not like them, and we may not like them as a society as a whole, but it's clear they are a safe intersection choice. And so the challenge for us as transportation practitioners is to make that clear, to keep up the engagement with the public and the older users as well, and make it clear why a roundabout is the preferred option at that intersection. And it's also true, I would say, that for areas that have implemented more and more roundabouts, and they become less unknown, less scary, less new, I guess, and more accepting. But I'm not aware of any research specific that looks at acceptance by an age demographic. So great question, but I'm not aware of the age specific demographics, but we certainly would know about the extra benefit from a safety standpoint to the older community. Great comment.
Thanks, Mark. Matthew wrote, not a question, but an observation. The biggest challenge or obstacle with implementing roundabouts for the older population is convincing them that change is good. Older drivers are set in their ways and don't like change. Otherwise, roundabouts are great benefit for older drivers.
Yep, it's I can't disagree with the comment. All I can offer is this advice to be persistent, because we are ultimately trying to save lives, and intersections in particular are problematic for older drivers. And when crashes do occur at older drivers, the outcome tends to be more severe. So it's really all the more reason why we have to be persistent. And it's not that you're gonna win every time. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that come into play when making decisions about whether an intersection should be a roundabout or any innovative design or just a traditional traffic signal. But a lot of times our preferred option is preferable in terms of the safety performance. And in terms of older users, they have the most at stake. They have the most to lose. And so my encouragement or my advice is to remain vigilant, remain persistent. And I think that is our obligation as traffic safety professionals. It won't always turn out the way perhaps we would like it to, but if we are truly going to embrace a safe system approach where we are attempting to, over time, transform our roadway environment to be more survivable, roundabouts are a big part of that equation, especially at intersections where we know we have vulnerabilities, where we know our vehicles, especially in relation to T-bone crashes from red light running or blowing through a stop sign, or not making a proper judgment of a gap in left turning traffic. All of those collisions at intersections we know to be problematic, and roundabouts are very effective at taking away the opportunity for those types of crashes to occur. So be persistent, be vigilant. It's all I can offer as a mantra. But yeah, I can't say I disagree with the comment. I think you're spot on.
Thanks, Mark. There's a question from Jenny who says, Are people aware that pedestrians who are blind cannot navigate roundabouts?
Jenny, yeah, so there has been a lot of research done at looking at strategies to make roundabouts accessible and to have features for roundabouts where the visually impaired, because compared to a traffic signal where we are stopping traffic, at a roundabout, traffic could continuously be moving, right? You have circulating traffic. It may be hard to discern for a visually impaired person what direction the vehicle is coming from. But it really boils down to yielding behavior. And sadly, when looking at research at driver yielding behavior, well, it demonstrated the problems that many communities have, and it is regional. I think there are examples where driver yielding to pedestrian behavior does change based upon the region, and even within a state, there may be differences where perhaps yielding rates are higher. But for roundabouts, there was a observed distinct difference between yielding behavior at single lane roundabouts and multi-lane roundabouts. Earlier, I indicated some of the conflicts that we have at multi-lane roundabouts that we don't have with single lane roundabouts for vehicular conflicts. For pedestrians, the yielding behavior at single lane roundabouts was much higher than at multi-lane roundabouts. And part of the challenge was the two lanes that are coming off of an exit, a two-lane exit from a circulating roadway, and the issue of even if the driver in one lane, this is say a pedestrian is in the splitter island and attempting to complete the crossing. Well, even if a driver in one of the two lanes, exiting lanes, stops, yields for a pedestrian in the crosswalk, a driver in the second lane may not understand why the driver in the other lane has stopped, and that stopped car may cast a visibility shadow where the driver can't see that the pedestrian is in the crosswalk. And so that multi the multi-conflict issue is a definite challenge. So there are strategies that are recommended for multi-lane roundabouts with crosswalks, enhancing the warning. So whether it be a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or a pedestrian hybrid beacon at multi-lane crosswalks, a raised crosswalk to help slow traffic, but also help the visibility of a pedestrian. So there are features that are captured that are recommended to make multi-lane crossings accessible. Because yes, Jenny is absolutely correct that there are challenges with multi-lane roundabouts for accessible pedestrian crossings, but there are recommendations for treatments that help in that regard. But absolutely, Jenny, it is a definite concern and consideration, particularly for multi-lane roundabouts. To our benefit, for single lane roundabouts, driver yielding is much higher. Good comment.
Thanks, Mark. We have a question from Ron. Should agencies consider narrowing the through lanes at intersections to improve the offsets for the turn lanes?
Yes, Ron, that is another strategy. So even if we can't physically create the positive offset through geometry, sometimes something as simple as maybe painting a little bit of an offset. Even 2 feet of offset can be advantageous. So yes, sometimes just through the pavement markings and kind of narrowing down a turn lane, basically creating a little painted buffer is a potential low-cost strategy that could be effective. So yeah, great suggestion.
Thanks, Mark. And we are right about at 2:30. So at this time, I think we'll wrap things up. There are some additional questions that we can pick up on Thursday. But Mark, I want to thank you for presenting today. Thanks everybody for your participation. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to part 2 of this series on Thursday afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing folks back on Thursday.
Yep. Bye.